Charlotte Liu, Managing Director Greater China for Macmillan Group. Welcome to the London Book Fair podcast.
It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Now, the goal of China's publishing industry is to go international. Can you tell us something of what the government is doing to make that possible?
Well, if I can give an analogy, China's objective in publishing industry is really to sort of reverse this trade deficit in this industry, because China as a country actually has a huge trade surplus because China sells more things to the rest of the world than what it buys from the rest of the world.
Sure.
But if you think about copyrights, if you think about publishing, the reverse is true. China actually imports a lot more copyrights and content from the rest of the world. So from a few years ago, the Chinese government started these initiatives to encourage more and more Chinese-produced content to go to other parts of the world. So these content tend to concentrate in Chinese culture, Chinese language learning, and increasingly Chinese scientific research outcomes as well. So there are a lot of incentives and subsidies and financial help are put into place to encourage these initiatives. And as Macmillan, we actually have been fairly successful and we're fairly well positioned to take advantage of these initiatives.
Now, essentially, UK-based operations such as Macmillan can neither publish in Chinese or distribute books in English. You need to find Chinese partners. Is that situation going to change in the near future?
Well, for most of the foreign publishers operating in China, we're all very familiar with the unique regulatory environment in China, and which is what you just said, that foreign publishers cannot publish independently within China, and we have to work with Chinese publishers. But the market potential and growth potential in China is so huge that it provides a huge incentive for foreign publishers to work with that regulatory environment and to work with Chinese partners to seek these growth opportunities.
Now, how does Macmillan work? I mean, how many titles do you translate into Chinese, and how many Chinese titles have been translated back into English?
So we, Macmillan Group, as a group in China, we cover several areas. The first area is obviously Macmillan Education. We're a full-service education publishing company. So we provide English language learning products for all age groups. We provide higher education learning products, and we also provide scholarly and reference titles. And the second part is Nature Publishing Group. So we bring a lot of the world's best research in natural sciences to Chinese institutions, to Chinese researchers, and we also publish the best research outcomes from China to the global audience.
Yeah.
And in this particular area, the language of science is English, really. So language translation doesn't really play a very critical role in this area. And the third part is the trade business we have, which is Pan Macmillan. And Pan Macmillan obviously is very strong in fiction, in children's titles, and some of the nonfiction titles as well. So in China, we recently formed a joint venture to publish and to translate some of the Pan's children's titles for the Chinese market.
Now, many international publishers are interested in setting up a base in China, Americans particularly keen. How should they go about that?
This is really a sort of fairly big spectrum. So on one end of the spectrum, you have people who just straightly import their products from outside of China for the Chinese market, and sometimes this works very well. And then you have some companies who operate sort of in the middle of the spectrum. They do some of the local translation, they even might do some of the local adaptation of their products for China. And then all the way on the other end of the spectrum, you have companies who actually start to develop completely sort of indigenous products just for the Chinese market, because the size of and the growth and diversity of China sometimes warrants a very local approach. And at Macmillan, we really believe if a company solely relies on straight import, sooner or later you're going to reach this growth plateau. And increasingly, we need to do more local adaptation, local translation, and the local product development. And that's really sort of the direction we're taking in China in the next several years.
There are around 600 state publishing houses. About half of those, I think, are based in Beijing.
Yes, Beijing is a major hub because it's the political culture center for China. So historically, most of the publishing houses are in Beijing. But if you look at the overall industry in China, it's been actually going through a phase of consolidation in the past decade or so. Because publishing industry for the longest time in China was not really very commercial. They're treated as sort of non-for-profit or an extension of government functions.
Yeah.
And that's changed in the past 5 to 10 years. So now you're looking at some of the smaller non-commercial publishing houses have gone out of business, and some of the smaller publishing houses have been acquired or integrated into much bigger publishing houses.
So very like the West, in fact.
Absolutely.
Yeah. There's a great number of cultural studios. Can you explain what they are and how they work?
So cultural studios are a very unique phenomenon in China. They're really a product of the Chinese regulation that only state-owned publishers are allocated or assigned ISBNs or book numbers to publish within China. So these are privately owned publishing operations in China, and they usually publish under the auspices of the state-owned publishers, but they have completely independent operations. They're usually very market-driven, they're very agile, and they do very well, but the reason they exist is another way to cope with the Chinese regulation that if you are foreign-owned, you're privately owned, you cannot publish independently.
In such a vast country as China, what's the infrastructure like? How sophisticated is the supply chain?
The amount of investment China has put into improving its infrastructure, I would say the equivalent might be what you would see in, under sort of the Roosevelt New Deal era.
Right.
And that's what China has gone through in the past 10 years.
So very spectacular.
Absolutely, and the result has been very pronounced.
And are they both chain and independent booksellers?
Yes, they're both. So if you go to, let's say, Beijing International Book Fair, you will see a lot of chain. And it's the same thing from book distribution, book retailer point of view. The industry is also going through a run of consolidation.
Now, educational and academic books are, of course, crucial. But what do people read for pleasure?
Well, from my observation, sort of professional and self-help books are very popular in China. For example, if you look at the Steve Jobs book, if you look at the Tiger Mom book coming from US,
yes.
For the first time, in many decades, now there is an emerging middle class in China, and the people are increasingly curious about the world and China's place in the world. And they have a very strong desire to plan and to control their own destinies, sort of both in their professional lives and in their personal lives. So this type of book usually has a very strong demand in China. And just with China's traditional emphasis on education, on English language learning as well, now as China become more and more sort of a global country. English language learning is considered by parents and by teachers as one of the most important skills for the next generation, both from, to be a global citizen and be sort of a effective employee in a new economy going forward. And then if you look at a younger generation in China, they're very comfortable with reading content digitally. They're probably as comfortable as their counterparts in other parts of the world. So the reading habit there, the infrastructure is there, so it really depends on the type of content being consumed, if it's more appropriate to be consumed in print or digitally.
Now, publishing everywhere is in a great state of flux. It's very hard to predict where we'll be in a few years' time, but if you had to guess, where do you think Chinese publishing might be in 5 years' time?
I think the industry will become more market-driven and more commercial as a result of the recent industry consolidation. And you start to see some of these major Chinese publishing and media groups emerging. And some of these companies even become publicly traded companies. So they will have a lot more financial resources to develop their businesses into new areas. And some of them even might go global. And the second aspect, we talked about the digital development. And I think the infrastructure in China is extremely ready for digital publishing and digital delivery and fulfillment and digital consumption of content. And if you look at all these major Chinese publishing groups now, they call themselves publishing and media. So they're not just limiting themselves to print publishing. They're looking at a digital delivery. And not just also just, you're talking about a straight ebook format. It's more value-added features and a more sort of enrich the user experience when they read their digital content. And lastly, I would just say, we talked a little bit about sort of, what's the forecast of regulatory change in terms of foreign publishers in China, I do feel you will see, nobody knows if this regulation will disappear in 5 years. We don't think it's very likely to be completely gone in 5 years' time. But I believe there is more room for foreign publishers to compete and to play within the Chinese market, all the way from all the sort of usual suspects, the large multinational Western publishing companies, to the smaller niche players. Because if you look at the overall economy in China, I mean, the economy is still growing at 10% every year, which is phenomenal compared to most of the Western countries.
Sure is.
And then the emerging middle class, we talked about their desire for self-improvement, to improve their life, the quality of their lives, or to send their kids abroad to study, sort of, trying to understand the rest of the world as China becomes more of a global country. I think there's a lot more foreign publishers can do within China, both for the consumer market as well as for the education market and for the scientific research market.
And finally, what do you say to European and British and American publishers who are coming to the London Book Fair and would like to begin doing business with China but perhaps haven't done so in the past? How should they get started?
I think it's about a little bit of homework, understanding what you can bring to China, the Chinese market, what's really needed there. So expand your thinking a little bit, not limit yourself to what you can sell to China, but also what you can bring from China to sell to the rest of the world, if you do have that expertise in that area.